Hello and welcome to Recap Radio. I'm Diego Cupolo, editor-in-chief of Turkey Recap, and this is our live show about Turkish politics and foreign policy. Today I'm talking to Neslihan Çevik, a sociologist and non-resident fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Culture at University of Virginia. Neslihan also worked at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Islamic Development Bank, and she's got a bit of a long CV, a few more things. She also is a
So
political
many
consultant.
hats.
Yes, we should say you're a thought leader, and that sums it up. But before finishing, I'll say
Thank
you're
you.
a political consultant that served as deputy chair of Gelecek Party, and before that, spokesperson of the Democrat Party here in Turkey. Thanks
After
again for
that,
joining us.
after Future Party.
Sorry, I got the order wrong.
Yes,
But thank you
that's
for
okay.
being here.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here and having this conversation. Actually, it's a quite exciting project for me. So
Well, last month, about 2 weeks ago, you wrote a commentary that's getting some attraction, let's say some traction in the national news, the website from the UAE. It's titled, "This is what the Muslim world needs to do to boost its birth rate." And in it, you note that people are having less children globally, but in places like the UAE and Turkey, we're seeing some of the steepest falls in childbirths. And
right.
a recent McKinsey report projected Turkey's population will fall 25% by the end of this century, forecasting that Turkey's current population of 85 million will decline to 65 million by the year 2100, which is shocking. That's because in recent decades, Turkey fell below the birth rate of 2.1 children per woman, which is the rate that countries need to keep the population steady. And we'll get into the nuances. So
Mhm.
any criticism about my language, please hold on to it. I'm not suggesting that women should do anything. I'm just giving the stats right now. In 2023, the average birth rate was 1.5 children per woman in Turkey. And as everybody knows, that's half of the 3 children that President Erdogan requests of women in Turkey. So we're making 1.5 children, populations declining. And for people in Ankara, policymakers, less people means less economic growth and other issues that might hinder Ankara's ambitions to raise Turkey from a regional middle power to a major global power. Noting that demographic dilemma, Erdogan declared 2025 the year of the family, offering couples financial incentives and state support programs to help them make babies. And while economic factors definitely play a role in family planning, most academic studies suggest post-birth incentives do not generally reverse low fertility rates. And as you argue in your piece, pre-birth costs, like requirements and expectations about marriage in cultures, that those seem to have bigger impacts on population trends, and we'll get into those. This includes wedding ceremonies, cultural factors, and pretty much what we believe is necessary to create a household and an environment to have children in the first place.
Right, to start a family. Yes, exactly.
So to finish, in this webcast, we're going to talk about the nuanced relation between marriage norms and falling birth rates across the world, and especially in Turkey. We'll also compare Turkey to regional trends, discuss whether Ankara's Year of the Family program might have an impact, and what peak humanity means for us all. So before getting into it, let me say this is a live recording. People listening to us right now live are welcome to send questions via the Substack chat. We hope to talk for 45 minutes to an hour. And Neslihan, thank you for being here. What made you start thinking about birth rates and fertility in the first place?
Again, pleasure to be with you. Well, actually, now usually when someone talks about fertility, they're typically a demographer. I'm not a demographer. I'm a sociologist and a policy practitioner who studies Muslim majority context and development. And fertility is at the core of that, particularly in today's development debates. And that's for a very simple reason. You kind of talked about it already. We do have a global fertility crisis. In fact, half of our countries today are below the replacement level of 2.1. And according to a Lancet medical journal study, by 2050, 75% of our countries will be below the replacement level. Um, in fact, back in 2017, when I was at the Research Bureau of Organization of Islamic Cooperation, we prepared a report on sustainable families for the 56 member states and their ministers. And in that report, I made sure that we had a section on fertility crisis that's coming up. Because although the fertility crisis is global, for some reason, for many decades, people thought that Muslims were exempt from it, that the fertility decline wouldn't impact Muslims. But that's not true at all. Even back then, the team made some projections for 2030, 2050. I just looked at it right before the broadcast, and I saw that the decline has happened even at a steeper and a faster way. Just an example, in 2017, Turkey was 2.2, so that's slightly above replacement. And today, not even 10 years, just 8 years, and we have 1.4, 1.48 to be more precise in Turkey. So I've been kind of interested in this debate. I've been kind of following it. But this particular article that I wrote for the National, it actually emerged very organically. I was just this last semester, I was teaching on female labor participation. And this is a subject, it's coupled with fertility, both in the public debate and the academic debate, because the traditional wisdom have us that, look, if you have women working, and then you have less babies. So it's kind of like this assumed dichotomy, right? And this was true for 60s, 70s, 80s. But in the 1990s, some Western scholars have picked up on something. The curve started to change for the Western societies, mostly Europe. And they called this the reversal of the old correlation. It was no longer the case that more women working creating, less fertility. But that study didn't say anything about Muslim majority societies. And so when I looked in class, I had my students look at data, and it was obvious that we are now experiencing as Muslim majority countries what the Westerns has experienced back in the 90s. More specifically, so we have Muslim majority countries with very high levels of female participation in the labor, but they also have very high fertility. And we have countries where you don't have a lot of women participating in the labor market, but you have low fertility. So that kind of showed me the data spoke, basically signaling that, look, the old wisdom, the old interpretation just doesn't fly anymore. So there has to be something else. So I wanted to see where the gap was. I didn't know where the research was going to land me, but this pretty much how the piece kind of got started.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's kind of the opposite of what a lot of foreign visitors say to me, at least when they come to Turkey from places like Europe, where they're not used to seeing many children. They come here and say Turkey is so young, right? You look
Yeah,
around, the playgrounds are full. I'm a father. I go to playgrounds pretty much every day, and they're packed. So I don't see this demographic crisis, but according to the statistics, it's happening,
yeah, oh
and
yeah.
it's making people worried. So I mean, just to do some basic foundational stuff, is it incorrect to say that as a country develops, the birth rate goes down? And you found some exceptions to that in France and
Yeah,
Sweden. So can you comment
yeah.
on that?
Absolutely. So I don't think that formula works. In fact, so let me give you some bit of a context, which would also help me to show how I ended up where the research landed me, basically. So right. So if you start with France and Sweden, these are epitomes of Western civilization, both in terms of secularization and also economic development. In those countries, you have 50-60% of women working in the labor market, and you have higher fertility than Turkey. But in Turkey, you have only 36% of women working in the labor market, and you have 1.4
Officially.
fertility. Officially, right. So officially, the formal work. So normally you would expect France and Sweden to have much lower levels of fertility than Turkey, but that's really not the case. And one may say, well, this is maybe just coincidental, idiosyncratic, maybe this is just Turkey. Not at all. If you look at GCC countries, for example, you also see the same thing. They have way lower ratio of women working. Take United Arab Emirates, the Emiratis, around 25% working. But then fertility is even lower than Turkey by 1.2. Now, let me add to that Latin America, very similar to France and Sweden. You have 60%, 50% participation in labor in countries like Brazil, Mexico, Chile, but you also have really high levels of, well, I shouldn't say really high, but higher than Turkey, around like 1.8, 1.9. So this was telling me, okay, well, we gotta figure out what else is going on. So this is an economic development. This is in higher education. It's probably not, secularization. Then I had a hunch. I don't know where the hunch came from, but it came. And then I looked at based on outside of marriage. And that was another twist. So in non-Muslim countries that I just mentioned, with high participation of female in the labor market, high fertility, there's something else that goes along with it. You have really high levels of babies being born outside of marriage. And when I say high, I mean like 60 to 70%. So this was interesting. So I went back and I looked at, Muslim nations data, and not surprisingly, we have only 2 to 3% of births outside of marriage. So that kind of told me, okay, so maybe it's about marriage itself. Maybe the main issue is marriage. But what about marriage, right? So what about marriage is causing possibly this fertility decline in Muslim societies? Again, the conventional wisdom would have it that, okay, well, so there's lots of westernization going on, secularization, higher education. Maybe given the fact that family is still a very traditional structure in Muslim societies, maybe young women just don't want to get married and put themselves in that, embed themselves in that traditional life. Could that be the reason? But then I looked at yet another twist, Bangladesh and Indonesia. You would be surprised they have much higher levels of labor participation, female participation than Turkey, close to France and Sweden, but they have replacement level fertility, 2.1 to 2.1. And they also have only 2% babies outside of marriage. So traditional family remains, traditional marriage remains, but they somehow managed to keep fertility afloat, managed to have their women integrate into the workforce. So that kind of walked me through this idea of what I call the marriage ticket. So I think, at least based on this early draft research that I did, I think the main reason in Muslim majority societies can be marriage ticket, meaning whether marriage is accessible or not. Because here is the thing, in Muslim societies, the only accepted culturally, socially, in some cases even legally accepted way to have a baby is to get married. But if people cannot get married, if this one path to baby making is prohibitively expensive, what do? You simply don't get married. You can't get married. Then you end up not having babies. So I think that's kind of, at least in this, preliminary research, that's the conclusion that I came up to. And to me, this is a really important finding because if you look at the political discourse in Turkey and also beyond, this idea of dissolution of traditional family causes, fertility decline, it's kind of the main creed, right? And across the political spectrum, even the left agrees with that. So the left would say, okay, well, this is it, but this is a price, we're going to have to pay for modernity, for women's empowerment. And then you look at the conservative side and they're going to say, well, look, modernity is undermining traditional family. But basically, data just doesn't hold that up. So we don't have to pick between one or the other. The main issue is that we have one rising line, cost of marriage, pushing two curves down, marriage and fertility. So once we identify the problem as such and kind of take it out of this culture wars, because it's very popular to talk about it that way, we now have all these trad influence, like traditional wives, the trad wives, social media and all that stuff. It's important to correctly identify what's going on. Then we can start producing policies specifically that would target, family formation and make it easier. So my argument is basically that it's about the marriage ticket. Obviously, I haven't run a very detailed big data regression yet, and hopefully, as probably I'll mention it later in our talk. But hopefully, this is now turning into a project, and we can look into more detail and see what kind of relationships are there.
Yeah, just to underline on some of your points, apart from the culture wars and the childless cat lady rhetoric. I mean, that this all feeds part of it, right? It's that women aren't having children because it's their choice. You're arguing that in places like Turkey and the Middle East, people tend to have children only in marriage. And then, according to the latest data from the Turkstat in 2022, 3% of births in Turkey happened outside marriage, right? So, I mean, 97% of people are being born into marriages, which is extremely high. That's a interesting note. I didn't know.
That's the standard for.
I didn't know it was that high.
That's the standard for Muslim majority countries. Yeah.
So, and your argument is that if marriage is required to have that kid to make it acceptable, right, to make it suitable for everybody, the marriage costs can be prohibitive. So it is economic, but it's not just rent, right? It's also the marriage ceremony and the
Right.
dowry. Uh, and
See,
in
that
Turkey you have exchange of gold that can be extravagant sometimes at weddings and very costly. And what you notice in the Bangladesh and Indonesian cases is that they try to reduce that requirement, that
mhm,
social pressure of giving a lot of money at weddings, because we've all been to weddings in Turkey, right? There is an exchange of a lot of money regardless of the family's wealth. I mean, some people go into serious debt for
right.
that stuff. And Bangladesh and Indonesia
Oh,
are trying
yeah.
to stop that, which you say is helping the situation and creating
Mm,
environment that creates more children, because basically you're reducing the cost to entry as a family. Am I describing it
exactly.
correctly?
So in Bangladesh, absolutely. So let me just build on that. So in Bangladesh, there is this 1980 Dowry Act. Basically, it says the law basically says that you can't do dowries above this amount. And there's also lots of awareness campaigns and social pressure to keep weddings at a reasonably humble level. In Indonesia, it's more on the financial side. They've been quite creative in terms of like helping people who are going to get married with housing. So that's another thing, actually, hopefully we'll get to talk about. We need some new financial tools to make family formation accessible. Now, if we look at Turkey, for example, like what's the marriage ticket look like specifically? Turkey is a very good example. I mean, it's very eliminative. So 3% of words outside of marriage, meaning that marriage is still the only path to have children. But when you look at the economic situation in Turkey, first of all, you have youth employment at 18%. That's quite high.
Hmm.
And if you are lucky, you get a job. If you look at Turkey's salary range, according to some studies, we now have 50% of people working in Turkey either works at minimum wage or near minimum wage. Normally, if it's a 14 or 15,
What is minimum wage right now? 23,000.
so in dollars, it's like 22,000 in dollars. That would be 530 US dollars, something like that.
Yeah, so very
And
very little.
it's very, yeah, yeah. And imagine this too, like the ones people who are going to get married for the first time tend to be young. They've recently graduated. They don't have much job experience. So when they start their work life, they're going to start from a lower place anyway. And you're in a country where you have 50% of people working at the minimum wage. So minimum wage is no longer the floor, but the going wage. And normally, if it's 14, 15%, that's an alarming number for economists, right?
Mhm.
And so in Turkey, though, I mean, you mentioned the wedding costs and all of that, but I think in Turkey, the biggest item today is housing. So fertility crisis in Turkey is a housing crisis in reality, I think. Because, okay, I've just gave you some stats on, the minimum wage and stuff. So there was a study that looked at average rent in 31 large provinces in Turkey. And that's actually, so minimum wage is 530 US dollars. And then the average rent is like 480. So you are left with just a little bit of money for, bills, food, and God forbid, if you have a child, how are you going to take care of that? And if you look at Istanbul itself, which is where a lot of the, a high population, in fact, the average rent is already 650 US dollars, which is higher than the minimum wage. So you do the math, and it's almost impossible to get married. So the government must have picked up on it, and they've started this new program, Family and Youth Fund. It's 150,000 Turkish liras, which is what, like 3,500 US, something like that. That might be a good step towards the right path, but it's really symbolic. I mean, with that amount of money, you can only cover maybe 3 months of rent, and you have
To
to buy a refrigerator. I don't know, like all the costs that come
to
with it.
clarify, this is a loan, right? That they're offering interest-free
This is a
loans.
loan. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So they have to pay it back. That's another thing. So it kind of delays financial burden. And we have about 500,000 marrying in Turkey on a yearly basis for, over some consecutive years. And only this year, 80,000 people applied to the loan and 7,000 people were confirmed to get the loan. Again, this might show some sort of political will, but it's really symbolic, and we need more structural changes. Otherwise, we cannot really tackle the issue of, the accessibility of marriage basically in Turkey. And we can talk more about the policies if you want me to unpack further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so many. It's such a big topic that I'm trying to choose
Indeed.
where to approach it from. Uh, but I mean, let's just
Well,
stay with the economic cost for a second, because I mean, food prices are rising in Turkey more
yeah,
than most other countries. I usually walk out of a grocery store with 2 bags, and I've spent at least 1,000 liras. There's no way I spend less than
yeah,
that, and I'm not buying that much stuff, right? I have to go several times
just
a
the
week.
basics. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're making minimum wage, I just don't know how you manage that. And that is a
Yeah.
real limit to people's aspirations, I would say. So if you can't take care of yourself, you're not going to make a family. Do you think that it's also just a crisis of confidence in being able to support a family?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because this type of economic squeeze does not only impact our economic decisions; it also impact our social psychological processes, I suppose. So because marriage is basically starting your adult life, right? I mean, when you form a family, you become, this fully adult. Before then, you're still kind of, the single life and so forth. So that's a lot of responsibility. And you not only need to be ready to do that economically, but also, I think, psychologically. And this definitely creates a confidence issue and a hesitation on the part of the youth. And naturally, right? Because once you form a household, you become an individual, autonomous family, independent from your own family. So it really, really just makes it really, really difficult for the youth to do that. Now, going back to, if I can, to the policies maybe of what Turkey has been doing, because you mentioned that we branded the 2025 as Euro Family. But when you look at the policies, I think it's just like any other Muslim majority country. Most of the budget, most of the effort, most of the thought goes into post marriage. So people get married, they have a baby. Now let's help them out. This is okay. We need this. This is what we call, downstream policy. We do need that. But the point that I'm trying to make is there are actually two entry points when we think about policy. The first entry point is singles getting married, because married couples, families do not come out of thin air. I mean, you have to have single people to get married so that they can, get married and have a baby. So, but I think maybe it's a perception thing. Typically, in Muslim majority societies, with the emphasis on family, singles are seen almost as like liabilities and afterthoughts. But I think it should be the opposite. Singles must be one of the core components of any family policy, because if you can't marry them, you're not going to have babies, right? And so I think what Turkey needs to do is to step up the upstream policies, meaning, how do we convince young people to get married? How do we make marriage more accessible? But that's not enough. We also need to step up as a country on downstream policies, which is, after you get married. Right now, obviously, we have maternal leave, some child bonuses, all of that stuff. That's good, but it's not enough. Like compared to France and Sweden, it's absolutely not enough. And recently, there was a new policy that was enacted. I don't know if you had the chance to follow it just a few months ago. Civil servants in Turkey are now allowed to work only half time if they have a new baby or if they adopted a baby until the baby starts going to the
Mhm.
primary school, right? But it sounds really good, right? 50% work, um, great. But it does come with some sort of a cost. You also have to reduce 50% of your salary and benefits. So to me, that sounds not necessarily like a family friendly policy, but fiscal tightening. And it puts the responsibility on the shoulder of families, particularly women, because it's going to be women who's going to lead the work. If it's two civil servants in the family, it's 99% is going to be women. So you'll be taking women away from the workforce, which is counterproductive, because the more women if you have two paychecks in a family, it's easier to have a baby because of the economic pressures. So maybe it's well intended, but I'm not sure it's going to create the impact that the government is looking for. So I think both for the upstream and downstream, we need to sit down and then really think about what needs to be done. Maybe this can be considered as a learned experience that didn't work. Let's switch to another model. We need to become marriage smart in our portfolios. from the perspective of the state, both in terms of financial tools that we use, in terms of budgeting, but also in terms of understanding the society. What is going on? Why is this stuff happening?
Yeah, and that's why I mention the costs, the daily costs of life, because it is a bit of a math equation as well. And we have some comments detailing rent costs, which I appreciate because it is getting ridiculous to just exist in Turkey. And
Oh
then
yeah.
you have this 40% rate hike that comes every year now on your existing rate, and I mean that's hard. That's hard for everybody.
Yeah,
And I
one
want.
solution maybe we'll see more people moving if they, want to get married, they move back to their, parental house. And this was the model we used to have back in 50s, 60s,
Mhm.
70s. Maybe it's going back to that traditional model. That might be one
Yeah,
of the solutions people use, but we've seen what kind of problems that kind of created for,
yeah.
newlywed adults not having autonomy in terms of, their finances, in terms of, starting their life as two autonomous people, basically. So yeah, it comes out with so many. I mean, it touches upon so many other problems in the society. Really, fertility crisis is not just a fertility crisis. It kind of impacts, kind of like a chain reaction, impacts a lot of things.
Yeah, and I want to get to the family and community support after because I'm the primary caretaker of a young toddler, and that's my real job. Turkey Recap is my side job, my side full time job, but my real full time job is being a father. And doing it without support is a serious issue that I definitely want to get into. But before that, I just want to focus on these prices because the Year of the Family program does offer some incentives, but I think that they're so small that it might be, can I say that it can be offensive? That you're offering people with a newborn baby a one time payment of 5,000 liras, which is $120. A
Yeah.
baby does not, you're not going to do much with $120. I think the crib costs more than that in any store.
Oh yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and then families with a second child under this program get 1,500 Turkish lira, which I'm looking, it's 36 US dollars. And I mean, 36 US dollars a month to take care of a baby. I mean, there are programs, there is attempts to remedy this. It's also very little. It comes after the situation, and it's not building people's confidence that they can exist in this society, which is, I think, my way of describing what you're trying to say is that marriage ticket. Because before you make a family, before you get married, you need to feel like an adult, right? If you're living at home and getting by on simit and cheese, you're not going to feel very confident about sustaining another family. What do you make of these incentives because they just seem so low. Is it just
Yeah.
is this what is it?
Well, if the government really wants 2025 to be the year of family and not and don't want this just to be a slogan, they really need to step it up. Because all of these things, in terms of like how much support is being provided, it really is very symbolic. And we do need structural changes. We need to really step up. I mean, if they're serious about this, they need to really show that and step up. And it's not only, this support that they can provide. They need to also start dealing with the structural problems. High inflation, crisis in terms of like vulnerability and of currency, really weak job creation. So these are obviously long-term problems that we need to address, and then there are quicker ways to address at least to bring some relief for family formation. And if the government is serious about that, is serious about this year being a family year, they absolutely need to
Mhm.
step it up from what they have right now. Because I'm not sure if this is really going to move the needle. And there are countries actually like UAE recently had launched this new program called Medim. In Arabic, that means continuity. And I think I mean, we'll see how much effect it has. It's quite new. So we'll, look at data and see what happens. But basically, I think among the Muslim majority nations, at least they have understood the reality that things need to start before people form families, and they're trying to reduce the cost of marriage, including housing, including the wedding costs, and that might really help. So, and the thing is, we can't just have slogans anymore. I mean, this can't be just an issue of political mobilization, populism. This is a very serious issue. This is a very technical issue, and we
Mhm.
really need to step up at this point. Again,
Yeah.
just in 8 years, Diego, I mean, we didn't have to wait 20 years. Just in 8 years, we lost our population replacement level numbers and we're down to 1.4.
Yeah. And just before we get into more details, this is a very polarizing topic, and we should talk about how neither of us are trying to put forth a conservative or secular agenda
Oh,
here.
yeah,
Can
yeah.
can you can you talk about the culture war aspect of this? Because usually conservatives or white nationalists talk about birth rates, but uh,
Mhm.
how do you put it in
Yeah,
the Turkish context?
it's a bit difficult to talk about fertility precisely because of that. Because if you say let's have bigger families, you're constantly put in this box of being a conservative. And if you say, let's talk about women's rights, women's empowerment, economic, equality, gender equality in economic terms, then you're put in this, other side. Oh, you are against families. Um, and and this works for the politicians, right? I mean, I was a former politician. I've seen this work among some colleagues, actually, sadly. But populism always works. But this is very serious, and we need to really get out of that. And obviously, we're not going to. I mean, public debate can happen, and that's democracy. Everybody can say whatever they want. But when it comes to creating policies needs to be anchored in data, not some sort of a culture wars that's oriented towards populism and votes. This is
Yeah,
a very technical subject.
which is very hard to do because most of the discussions I see about this show the fertility map of Turkey, and Şanlıurfa has the highest fertility rate, and that's a mixed province, lots of Kurds, lots of Arabs, and
Yeah,
this only leads to racist comments, right? We're going to be taken over by those people, and the secular Turks
right.
that are commenting on Reddit at night, which I see, they're saying, our country's being taken away from us. So I mean that you easily get into serious heated debate
Right.
on
So
this, right?
that's a very good point. Fertility also relates to debates about immigration, and that relates to debates again in politics. And then it does create certain political movements that are on the extreme side. Let's just say. And that scare about, yeah, we're going to be taken over. The thing is, like fertility, immigration is also very, a topic of culture wars, and it's also complicated. But if you, I remember looking at some data again on this, and if you have educated immigrants, they actually improve your GDP. They also improve possibilities, production possibilities curve, which means sometimes a country needs to produce X amount of something, but this comes at the expense of that amount of, something Y or whatever. If you can improve your capacity, you can produce many of the things without sacrificing from another. And immigration precisely provides that. It enables that. So our conversations about immigration also needs to be more anchored in data. Obviously, in the Turkish case, rather than educated migrants, we have like fragile populations coming in. But at the end of the day, if you will look at globally and historically, like US, for example, we had lots of immigration in the US, and one of the reasons why US was able to remain younger than Europe is because of immigration.
Mhm.
Um, but now, politically, in the US too, immigration is becoming a very contentious issue. Not just the US, actually. I mean, globally, I think that's one of the another important development issues we have, and they all connect with one another. That makes it, more complicated,
Yeah,
obviously.
and looking while prepping for this podcast, I mean, it's very interesting to think about what the future looks like, because
Right.
a lot of the high fertility rates are in sub-Saharan Africa right now, and that will make a larger part of the world than it is today. That's where the population growth is, and you're seeing places like China and EU really collapsing. So you'll just see these balances of what humanity is changing drastically within our lifetimes. So I just want to, before we get into the what to do about this, I do want to raise the counter argument, which is like, what's what's wrong with falling birth rates? Because uh, I started as my journalism career as an environmental journalist, and we can talk about climate change and pollution and resources, but the end argument that people are not so comfortable with and is not popular, is that overpopulation is hazardous, and as long as you have too many people and a small planet with finite resources, it's not good. But like, what's the Is it really such a bad thing? Will the economies collapse if there's not constant growth of population?
Right. So a lot of people ask this rightfully. I mean, it's a reasonable question to ask, particularly given the climate change. But I think at the end of the day, I think it's a false dichotomy to put sustainability to one side and fertility to the other side. There are so many. It's almost kind of like, I'm going to give this example. Let's say my arm hurts. I go to the doctor. I say, "Hey, doc, my arm really hurts," and the doctor says, "Well, let me cut it." So the pain is gone, but the patient is unfunctional because lacks a arm now. So trying to solve sustainability problem by cutting fertility, it would wobble the whole system. Um, One of the reasons is economic. I mean, supply, demand, GDP, all of that. But even more important than that is, I think, what are we going to do about our pension systems? What are we going to do about our older population? Right now, it used to be more generally that when you look at the age structure of our world, it was a triangle. So you have older people there and then younger people at the bottom. Now it looks more like an obelix, meaning kind of like a reverse triangle. And that's not a good thing because younger people who are working has to support older people. And just, let's talk about Turkey. Well, step back. Normally, the healthy ratio is 3 to 1, meaning you have 3 workers supporting 1 retiree. That's considered a healthy threshold. In the US, I think that's 4 to 1, which is, really good. When you look at Turkey, it's half of that. So we have 1.5 workers, young workers, supporting a retiree. Now, this is quite alarming because within 20, 30 years, with these levels of decline, it's going to come down to 1 to 1. So what happens when this happens, when ratio really declines like that? Well, the pension system has a lot of pressure. Maybe at some point, we're going to have to transfer treasury directly to our elderly and to the retiree population. Or maybe we're going to have to end up really erasing the real salaries, basically, or we're going to have to work 90 hours, 100 hours a week. Now, AI here may come into the picture in terms of productivity. If it increases productivity, then, maybe that shifts the curve there. But with AI, we're also going to have job loss. So we can't really rely on that. So basically, it's about, and this isn't just a capitalist economic point of view. I'm talking about social cohesion. What are we going to do with our parents? What our kids are going to do with us? I mean, are they going to say, well, you know what, let's go do whatever you want to do, just live on the streets? Like, that's not, like, we can't do that. That's not just an economic concern. It's about our values as a humanity, whether religious or not, whatever. So that's one thing. And second thing is, it's also not just economy. I mean, from a state's perspective, it's also fertility is defense. So young people provide military manpower. And if you look at, for example, South Korea and some of the nation members, there's still, there already is a lot to hurdle. So you want younger people as part of your defense. Another issue is immigration. Immigration, you're going to need to have with lower fertility, less workers, and aging people. Also, we need to consider how now we live longer, right? We don't die now at like 50, 60. Our life expectancy is pretty high now. So that's also another problem. So we're going to need skilled and semi-skilled workers, to work basically, and that's going to require immigration maybe. And again, that's going to produce some sort of political backlash. That's also going to produce, more populism. So as you can see, fertility isn't just about, people making babies. It's about our society's fundamental needs to continue our lives basically, and to take care of each other, to have this intergenerational cohesion, and then also the defense system, and being able to support, our own societies. So I don't think, there's this type of dichotomy between sustainability and fertility. When
Yeah.
you say that, you basically take the responsibility away from the states, right? The governments need to be smarter about this. We have lots of intergovernmental organizations. Those organizations already have some sort of policies for, after marriage. They can shift their portfolios. So there are stuffs that we can do. We don't have to just say, cut my arm, doc, I don't want it. This just, I don't think that
Mhm.
would really work.
Yeah, but what do you make of women's choice in all this? Because Erdogan has his comments about requesting 3 children per woman. I mean, if we're talking about security of the state and keeping the country going in the economy, I mean, we're getting some comments that Erdogan's not actually serious about this whole family planning program. Is it? How do you feel about it? Does it just prevent? Does it
Mm.
remove the enthusiasm to have children when it's so politicized?
Yeah, when it's so politicized and when it's economically unattainable, people can't really be moved by this slogan, let's just say. I understand where the governments, including Turkey's, come from in terms of saying, let's have more babies. But how realistic is that if you don't provide the necessary institutional support? And that institutional support is important from a statistical point of view too. So, like if you look at France, for example, in France, women, because we're talking about women's choices. Let's say a woman wants to spend more time in her career, then get married, then have a baby. Normally, we say, "Oh, you know what? Delayed marriage, not good, not many children." But in France, we see that the data doesn't show that. Actually, delayed marriages didn't necessarily result in fertility decline. So in Turkey, we can have the same thing if we have the proper, appropriate, effective institutional support. So if a government wants its population to reproduce and at a high level, then they have to provide the institutional support to enable the citizens to shoulder part of a large part of the, burden. And then maybe we'll have, that type of fertility going on. And in regards to women's choice, again, like this really, so this broader argument about secularization, women's empowerment, and all of that, it's just that the data doesn't show it. So even women, because you can look at, again, France, Sweden, Caribbean, women who are having babies out of marriage, which is 60, 70%, apparently they're not necessarily, in the core of this traditional perception of marriage, but they're still having babies. So just because a woman is empowered pursuing a career doesn't mean she doesn't want to have a baby. It's just that the institutional setting, the ecosystem woman lives in, does it enable that or does it not enable that? And that's why we say we need to get out of the culture wars because they work as blinders. They're very useful for politicians, but for us, for policymakers, for people who are supposed to come up with solutions, I think they work as blinders and they make our lives more difficult.
Or easier because you don't have to solve anything,
Or
right?
easier. Or yeah, or that. If you want to take that route, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's many things I want to comment on. We're running out of time. Maybe we have 15 more minutes. Um, on community support and financial incentives, I mean, what can realistically in Turkey, we do have a financial crisis that's been ongoing for at least 7 years. What can the government do differently based on our reality?
Yeah.
Realistically, is the question.
Um, the short-term solution, a realistic solution, would be tapping into educated females and bringing them into the labor market. Um, in terms of releasing the pressure we have on the pension system due to already declined fertility. Just to give you a projection, if tomorrow we wake up and now we have 5 or 6 more million women getting into the Turkish labor market, this has an impact of 20% reduction in the worker to retiree ratio. So that's one of the fast ways to kind of
Mhm.
keep the system going, not improving fertility, but basically buffering the impacts of low fertility that we are seeing right now. Because more women working will mean more taxes, more fiscal budget. It's going to help the government to kind of make, also new policies in that sense. But in the longer term, what I am suggesting, obviously, I mean, one article, we can't tackle everything all at once. We have limited time, limited resources. We need to pick something and then kind of concentrate on that. And what I suggest, given this preliminary research that I did, is we need to create an index, and I call this ease of family formation. And this would be quite similar to the World Bank's ease of doing business. The aim here would be basically measuring how hard or how easy it is to form a family. And if you have a higher score, then it's easier. If you have a lower score, then it's more difficult. And this would allow us, first of all, to understand the whole map. So what goes into the cost of marriage and how bad it is. And if we can have an index like that, it would become visible. What becomes visible gets into the budget. What gets into the budget gets some sort of a solution at the end of the day. And I already kind of am starting to turn this into a project and trying to put together a team of experts ranging from Saudi Arabia to the United States. I mean, we'll see how. So wish me luck. We'll see how this will pan out. But one of the things we have to do is to first to have this type of a measurement. I mean, we have different numbers like how much does it cost in terms like rental costs or age of marriage and all of that, but we don't have an index. So I think one of the things that we need to do is to measure it so that we can produce the correct policy. Where is the choke point? Where would we have the highest impact? How can we solve this problem? If you talk about only from assumed dichotomies, culture wars, I mean, we don't have data, so it's going to take us to the wrong policy. So that's another thing we need to do. I think we need to have a sober mind. At least we need to have more sober voices in the public debate about what is going on, what can be done. The debate on culture wars can continue. It will continue. But then we need to have the alternative voice where we're talking about, the real policy challenges on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, those are definitely useful points. I'm thinking how this reflects regionally, because
Mm-hmm.
birth rates are down in the Middle East, as you pointed out in the beginning, where it's not just Turkey experiencing this. So do you think that, to bring it back to the marriage and the costs of setting up that household, do you think that there's a top-down solution to just telling people to stop spending so much money for marriage? Because you see it on Instagram. People are going crazy for these proposal videos. I mean, those
Oh
cost
yeah.
more than some marriages, just
Oh yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah, you're
exhibitionism
right.
of marriage.
Even the proposal costs more than the wedding. You're right. Now, it really depends on the country and the context. So, if you look at GCC, for example, weddings are one of the really high tickets. In United Arab Emirates, a typical Emirati wedding last year would be costing you $80,000 US. And that's last year. Saudi Arabia has had a 30 to 40% boost or incline in their wedding costs. That's a lot. There's also housing shrinkage in Saudi Arabia. Same in Qatar. In Qatar, both the housing issue, housing crisis, and rising wedding costs are delaying people to get married. So it's not just Turkey, it's not just Egypt, it's not just Iran. It's also, supposedly oil-rich countries are also having, this fertility problem, and then this marriage ticket becoming more and more impossible to reach. In fact, just last week I was talking to a person, a colleague of mine who used to do lots of policy work in Saudi Arabia. She also pointed out to the issue of rents and housing shortages in Saudi Arabia, and that how Saudi government is actually keeping an eye on this issue and trying to, come up with solutions. They have this new research. They're trying to, I think, map how young people's perception about marriage. This is another important aspect of it, obviously. But my research was more focused on labor participation, hence, the marriage ticket. And dowry is a problem in some other Muslim contexts, maybe not as much in Turkey, except in certain areas. Another problem we have regionally is, I think, stigmas about women's work. Because if you can have two paychecks, obviously it makes it easier to start a family and to sustain the family. But if there's lots of stigma around women's work and how that might prevent, supposedly motherhood, then people are less willing to engage in work. There's also lots of stigma about delayed marriage. If a woman, let's say about 26 and so, she might get stigmatized for not having the fertility, vitality, which is not true. Again, the French case shows that even delayed marriages does not come necessarily with reduced birth rates. So these are some of the bottlenecks on the more cultural side we have in the Muslim world. But I don't think they are, unbeatable with the correct type of policies. And again, like to me, I think at the end of all of this research, what really, really stick with me is this idea that no, we're not necessarily losing our desire to have babies just because we're more urban and modern. We do want to have babies as humans. We still do want to have babies. It's just we need the correct institutional support to do that. This is where the citizen and state actually comes face to face. They need one another. The state needs the citizens to reproduce, and then citizens need the state to actually make that happen, to make that a possibility now.
Yeah. I also think, I mean, we can go on forever on this, but just to point out, I think that there's also higher expectations for what
Mm.
we can provide as parents. I think that people compare a lot when they're looking at social media. I think that there's organic food and non-organic food. And, these choices didn't exist when I was a kid. So I would go to McDonald's and that was fine. But now some people would say, how dare you take your child to McDonald's and, save yourself an hour of cooking at home. So there's this higher expectation on the parent, which is kind of unfeasible when you have a full-time job. And I'm sure that's playing into a factor. And then to talk about families, I mean, how much of this is just moving, because families used to stay near each other. And then as
Yeah.
you have more job opportunities across the country, Turkey has developed a lot in the last 20 years. I think that Erdogan also created universities in all the provinces, or about all of them, right? So that's keeping some families local. Some people are moving. Sometimes decisions to have children is just based on like whether you can throw your child at your mom, right, while you
Oh,
get
yeah,
something
yeah, yeah.
done. Do you think that that's also a factor?
I bet that it is. I mean, we have this saying, "It takes a village to raise a child," and which is, absolutely very true. But I think that's one of the realities of modern society. Again, this can be supported by policies. In fact, I couldn't find it. I had it with me, but I had this simulation done. I thought about, okay, well, because when I looked at Turkey's female labor participation birth rate, I saw that in times when informal work for women was higher, so agricultural work, just working at the family business, whatever, you still have really higher levels of fertility. So what if we can replace and replicate informal work type of environment, but then apply that for formal work? And one of the simulation parts is about having a community around women, because in the informal work area, you have family with you, you are in the family, or you're maybe out in the field, but then there are other women with you, and so they help you with your child. So um, what if we can produce kind of like this out of the box new innovative policy solutions for that kind of problem, right?
Yeah, and
So
that
I think
means that means realistically, basically making it easier to insure workers, right? Because agricultural workers are not registered in Turkey, and a
yeah.
lot of those are women. So, I mean, maybe it has to do, when you're talking about policies, you're talking about formalizing informal work and making it affordable for bosses, right? That would be one way.
It could be, but where I'm coming from is more like, okay, so apparently informal work allows it's still work. It's not like women are just sitting on a couch; they're still working, and it's like
Mhm.
manual heavy work too, right? But they're still having more babies, right? So how can we replicate that? What are some of the benefits of that type of work arrangement? Maybe we're not seeing it clearly. Maybe we need to look at this again. And one of the things that popped up, and that's because you mentioned community in informal work, one of the important items is having the community support because you have the family around. So we need to create that type of community like support around women, so that childcare is much easier, given also high levels of mobility, as you mentioned. Because in order to find a job, also not just educational reasons, but for finding a job, you'd have to maybe change cities. This wasn't a thing in Turkey before, but I think more and more women are also moving because of precisely because of that reason to bigger cities where you already have lower levels of community. It's more individualistic.
Mhm, mhm.
Neighbors don't know. So for the audience who may not have ever visited Turkey, may not know Turkey, Turkey used to be a very friendly, neighbor-friendly place. I mean, to a level where every neighbor was involved in each other's business, and that can be a problem. But still, it kind of shows that really high levels of social cohesion. And still, this kind of goes on in the family with like grandmothers and grandparents being really, really involved in their grandchildren's lives and care, particularly before the primary school. Even after primary school, the kid comes from the school and then stays at the grandma's or the grandpa's house until the parents come back from work. And not every family have the capacity, the financial capacity to basically use preliminary care, professional care, because can be quite expensive. But yeah, I mean, again, there's so many. It's a multifaceted issue, but we need to start from somewhere, and it needs to be tangible. It needs to be targetable, and specific enough so that we know what to do and we can measure it.
Mhm.
So, and from my perspective, I think We need to start thinking more about the upstream policies. We already have some stuff going on for downstream. That's after you have the baby or after you get married. But I think if we, the real choke point is the upstream. Many
Yeah,
more
the
singles not getting married.
yeah, the final question that keeps echoing in the back of my head is just young people commenting on internet forums saying there are no jobs.
Yeah.
What jobs? Because people do graduate from university in Turkey, right? And then
Yeah.
they don't find work and they're complaining about it. So when you're talking about bringing women into the workforce, yes, of course, but what are they going to do is my question, because I see the complaints nonstop every day online that there are no
Yeah.
jobs and the only jobs go to people with connections with the ruling party, stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, no, this is youth in Turkey, unfortunately, perceive very high levels of nepotism unless your uncle is someone or your dad is connected this or that way. And that even impacts entrepreneurial activity, not just finding a regular job. Because if you live in a society where you can't believe in your own abilities, then you end up not doing a startup. You end up not opening up that thing that you want to open up. So it impacts both traditional employment and entrepreneurship. But right, so these are the structural issues the Turkish government needs to address, and it's not sustainable to go, as we have been going. I mean, something's got to give, and what is giving right now is, declined marriage, declined, fertility. It's gonna have to change. Also, I think there's lots of I mean, we're kind of stepping into another policy area. The graduates have really this gap between what the employers want, skills gap. That's what it's called. So
Mhm.
employers want a particular set of skills. The graduates don't have that. So even if there are available jobs, graduates can't get those jobs because their skills just don't match it. That's one of the other problems. I think educational system also needs to be more attuned to the market needs. And AI is going to make traditional education quite redundant anyway. So we have to start thinking about new ways how that's going to impact the labor market. So that's the thing. Like all of these things again in development, it's a chain. It's relationality. You can't just take one issue, put it to the side as if it's a box and say, oh no, I'm only looking at this. It just doesn't work that way because it's very relationally connected to one another. But I see your point. Yeah, you need to create more jobs in order to have female participation. But once, if you can somehow start integrating women, you're going to have, again, a higher GDP. You're going to have higher production possibility curve, meaning you're going to increase your capacity to support more people. So it's a chain thing, with both with the good and the bad. If you do the good, then you keep having the good chain, coming back to you.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, my family is Italian, and every time I visit Italy, I look at cities made for much more people than currently live there. And I'm wondering if that's going to be Turkey in, 30 years, where you're looking at these
Yeah.
huge apartment complexes, but they're empty, right?
Yep.
Well,
Exactly.
I guess we'll see. Um, I'm going to wrap it up there. We're at the 1 hour mark, and I have to pick up my child. So-
Yeah.
And
Okay. You do your
so,
part, your contribution
exactly.
to the fertile. Yeah. Exactly.
For anyone that joined this talk late, I've been talking to Neslihan Çevik. She's a sociologist, not a socialist, a former politician, consultant, and non-resident fellow at University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. Thank you for joining us, Neslihan.
Thank you for the invite. This was a very nice conversation. Great to be,
It,
very pleasure to be here.
it went very fast. I hope it was good for the listeners too. If you missed the beginning of this show, you can find the full recording on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and other places where I'll provide links to the articles and things we mentioned in this talk. This podcast is a production of Turkey Recap, a newsletter on Turkish politics and foreign policy and business. I'm coming to you live from Ankara. Neslihan's also in Ankara, I believe. Visit
Yes, and it's
Turkey
very
Recap.
hot yet again, annoyingly hot.
Yes, it's almost over and then we'll miss it.
Yeah,
But
that's also
stay
true.
safe. Thank you for joining.
Bye.